Good morning, everybody. It is 4 a.m. How are you doing this morning? So, the only reason that I haven't been able to do a recording in the last 3 days was because I was studying for a test, and let me tell you, I aced it. So, moving on with what we were talking about before with empathy, we previously covered empathy and defined it as a feeling with someone, as feeling with someone. Being able to put yourself in their place as if you were them and feeling those feelings. Okay? There are several different elements that make up empathy. There are also, however, different types of empathy, right? That have been defined by psychologists. These are cognitive, emotional, and compassionate empathy. In today's podcast, we're going to cover these as briefly as I can. I'm going to cover each one of them in segments. Again, this is Thoughts If It Were You, Food for Thought by Neo Gentrics. And let's go ahead and begin and start with cognitive empathy. Also known as perspective taking, is not really what most of us would think of as empathy at all. Cognitive empathy is basically being able to put yourself into someone else's place and see their perspective. It is a useful skill, particularly in negotiations. For example, or for managers. It enables you to put yourself in someone else's shoes, but without necessarily engaging with their emotions. It does not, however, really fit with the definition of empathy as feeling with, being a much more rational and logical process. Effectively, though, cognitive empathy is empathy by thought rather than by feeling. So this makes this just as effective. However, a dark side to cognitive empathy. It is possible to show cognitive empathy without having any fellow feeling or sympathy with it. It is fair to say that most of us would understand this feeling, fellow feeling, to be a key part of empathy. Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, notes in his blog that torturers would need to have good cognitive empathy to work out how best to hurt someone, but without having any sympathy towards them whatsoever. And this, in fact, is a thing. Hold up. I can understand that you, at this point, you're like, well, with that in mind, cognitive empathy doesn't seem like empathy and is not exactly a good thing, or it's cold hearted. Well, in reality, it does actually help doctors and nurses keep them from becoming too attached to their patients and overreacting to the point where they can't help you. However, it also helps them balance out their emotional empathy as well. Emotional empathy is when you quite literally feel the other person's emotions alongside them as if you had caught the emotions as well. Emotional empathy is also known as personal distress or emotion contagion. This is closer to the usual understanding of the word empathy, but more emotional. Okay? Emotional empathy is probably the first type of empathy that any of us feel as children. It can be seen when a mother smiles at her baby and the baby catches her emotion and then smiles back. Less happily, perhaps, a baby will often start to cry, and if he or she hears another baby crying, especially, or if the others hear them, they start crying too. Keep in mind that with emotional empathy, it can also be good and bad. Okay? Emotional empathy is good because it means that we can readily understand and feel other people's emotions. This is vital for those in caring professions such as doctors and nurses, as I mentioned before. But to be able to respond to their patients appropriately, this is also a major issue. Okay? This also means that we can respond to friends and others when they are distressed. However, emotional empathy is bad in the sense that because it is possible to become overwhelmed by these emotions and therefore unable to respond, this is also known as empathy overload, okay? Those with a tendency to become overloaded or overwhelmed need to work on their self-regulation and particularly their self-control so that they can become better at managing their own emotions. Good self-control helps doctors and nurses to avoid possible burnouts from empathizing too much. There is a danger, however, like I mentioned earlier when I talked about the good, that they can become hardened and not respond appropriately. There have been several cases in the UK, such as Staffordshire, where nurses and others were accused of being uncaring. This may have been a possible result of overprotection against empathy overload, in which cases it's not entirely a bad thing, but considering the number of people that they see daily, I can understand. Moving on, compassionate empathy. Okay, final, finally, compassionate empathy. Compassionate empathy is what we usually understand by empathy. Um, Feeling someone's pain and taking action to help. Okay, as the name suggests, compassionate empathy is consistent with what we usually understand by compassion. Like sympathy, compassion is about feeling concern for someone, but with an additional move towards action to mitigate the problem. Compassionate empathy is the type of empathy that is usually most appropriate. But as a general rule, people who want or need your empathy don't just need you to understand, okay? Which is cognitive empathy. Um, and they certainly don't need you to just feel their pain or worse, to burst into tears alongside them, which is emotional empathy. Instead, they need you to understand and sympathize with what they are going through, and crucially, either take or help them to take action to resolve the problem, which is compassionate empathy. That's basically the whole gist of that. Then you have to find the balance, okay? Cognitive empathy can often be considered under emotional. It involves insufficient feelings and therefore perhaps too much logical analysis. It may be perceived as an unsympathetic response by those in distress. Okay? As for emotional empathy, by contrast, is over emotional. Um, that's one of those things that we mentioned earlier. Too much emotion or feeling can be unhelpful. Um, and I will cover how to manage your emotions, don't worry. Um, Emotions are very primitive. Okay, feeling strong emotions, especially distress, takes us back to childhood, more or less by definition. That makes us less able to cope and certainly less able to think and apply reason to the situation. It's very hard to help anyone else if you are overwhelmed by your own emotions. So, with that being said, in exercising compassionate empathy, we find the right balance between logic and emotion. Okay, we can feel another person's pain as if it was happening to us, and therefore express the appropriate amount of sympathy. At the same time, we can also remain in control of our own emotions and apply reason to the situation. Okay, this means that we can make better decisions and provide appropriate support to them where and when it is actually necessary. Okay. And I point this out specifically because it's one of those things that people tend to overlook. All right. So, with that, I am finished with covering empathy. Next, we're going to cover understanding others and how to manage your emotions.